I'll never forget the day we moved into our new home. My family had been dreaming about this for years: a quiet neighborhood, spacious yard for the kids, and enough room for all our hobbies. The streets were lined with freshly cut grass, and every house seemed to have a perfectly trimmed hedge. I thought we'd stepped into one of those magazine spreads where everything looks too perfect to be real. From the moment we arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and relief. The kids ran ahead, exploring the cul-de-sac like it was a private park. My spouse unpacked the moving truck with a sense of pride that only comes from finally owning a home you've worked years to afford. I stayed back, taking in the neighborhood, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and cut grass. Everything seemed peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. And then I saw her, Karen. She was standing on the front porch of the house across the street, holding a clipboard, wearing what I would later recognize as her standard, authoritative suburban uniform, a pastel blazer that somehow said both, "I mean business," and "I host weekly brunches." Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid, and her eyes were fixed on me with a gaze that could make a grown man feel like he'd just been caught stealing candy from a toddler. Karen waved, and at first I waved back. I thought, sure, maybe she's just a neighbor who likes to greet new people. But there was something in the way she smiled that didn't reach her eyes, a calculated, knowing smile. The kind of smile that says, "I see you, and I am already judging you." I shrugged it off, thinking, okay, maybe I'm just being paranoid. After all, everyone has quirks. And for the first hour, everything was fine. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and even let the kids climb a tree in the yard without worrying too much. It was only when Karen approached the sidewalk that I realized the quirks might be extreme. She stopped in front of our house, clipboard at the ready. "Hello, I'm Karen," she said with a tone that sounded friendly but somehow also like a warning. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I just want to make sure you're aware of our homeowner association rules." I blinked. Homeowner association rules. "Yes," she said, nodding seriously. "Our community prides itself on harmony, aesthetics, and order. We have certain guidelines that every homeowner is expected to follow. It's all for the good of the neighborhood." She smiled again, the same smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be stopping by soon to discuss your membership." I smiled politely, trying not to show how unnerved I already felt. "Thanks, Karen, we'll consider that." But something in her demeanor told me that considering wasn't going to cut it. She didn't wait for a response, just nodded sharply and walked back to her porch, clipboard clutched like a sword. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching us. Every time I left the house, I saw her across the street, clipboard in hand, as if she were cataloging every movement my family made. The kids joked that she was like a secret agent, and part of me half expected her to pull out binoculars or a tiny notepad with our names on it. But this wasn't funny, at least, not yet. I tried to focus on settling in, unpacking boxes, and teaching the dog where the good spots in the yard were. But the tension was there, creeping into everything. Every time the mailbox rattled, I half expected a letter from Karen. Every time a neighbor waved, I wondered if they were secretly on her side. It wasn't just paranoia. Something about Karen was different. She didn't just care about lawns and paint colors. She seemed obsessed with control. And from the first day, I realized that moving into the perfect neighborhood might not be the peaceful experience I had imagined. That night, as we sat down to a quiet dinner in our new kitchen, I told my spouse, "I think we have a problem, and her name is Karen." And that was the beginning of a series of events that would turn our dream neighborhood into a stage for one of the most ridiculous, stressful, and surprisingly satisfying conflicts I've ever experienced. Little did I know, our refusal to follow Karen's imaginary rules would escalate faster than I could have imagined, and that the next time we saw her, it wouldn't just be words on a clipboard. It started innocently enough. A thick envelope slipped into our mailbox, the kind of envelope that immediately makes you question your life choices. The return address read Homeowner Association, and my stomach sank. I already had a feeling I knew who was behind it. I tore it open, expecting something bureaucratic but mundane. Instead, I was greeted with Karen's handwriting sprawled across the top in perfectly neat cursive, like she had personally labeled every envelope in the neighborhood herself. The letter began politely enough, inviting us to join the HOA and participate in community harmony. But the tone quickly shifted. Every sentence carried a subtle warning, a reminder that life in our neighborhood came with rules. Rules about lawn heights, mailbox decorations, and even what color towels could hang on the line. I glanced at my spouse, eyebrows raised. Do we join? I shook my head. No, I don't think we should. We didn't move here to be micromanaged by a woman with a clipboard. We sealed the letter back up and set it aside, thinking that would be the end of it. We had ignored worse from officious people before, but Karen had other plans. The next evening, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Karen, standing there like an agent of fate herself, clipboard clutched tightly. She smiled, but that smile carried the weight of someone about to lecture the world on morality. Good evening. I just wanted to personally check in, she began, walking straight onto our porch as though invited. It's important that all residents understand the HOA rules and obligations. Community harmony depends on it. I tried to hide my irritation behind a polite smile. Thank you, Karen, but we've decided not to join the HOA. We appreciate you checking in. Her smile faltered for a split second before regaining its perfect, eerie form. Decided not to join? I see. Well, it's very important that everyone in the neighborhood follows the guidelines. Otherwise, her voice trailed off dramatically, as if the universe itself would collapse without her supervision. Otherwise what? I asked cautiously, but already knew the answer would be absurd. Otherwise, there could be consequences. You wouldn't want to disrupt the harmony of the community, would you? She said, tapping her clipboard like it was a scepter. I couldn't help but stifle a laugh. We'll do our best to be harmonious in our own way. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, though she didn't lower her clipboard. We all have a role to play. It's for the good of the neighborhood. She turned on her heel and walked back toward her house, leaving me standing there, trying to figure out if I should feel threatened, amused, or both. Over the next few days, the tension escalated subtly. We noticed Karen patrolling the street more frequently, sometimes stopping to adjust a neighbor's mailbox or point out a crooked flower pot. It was like living in a movie where the villain doesn't wield a sword or a gun, but a clipboard and an obsession with order. Every glance toward her house carried a hint of judgment, a silent reminder that she was always watching. The neighborhood, for its part, was split. Some neighbors quietly nodded in agreement with Karen's ideals, while others whispered to each other about her overbearing tendencies. We tried to stay out of the gossip, but it was unavoidable. Every time the mailbox rattled or a new letter appeared, my heart skipped a beat. Each envelope seemed heavier than the last, laden with a mix of authority, absurdity, and menace. One evening, while helping the kids with homework, I glanced out the window and caught sight of Karen talking to another neighbor. She gestured toward our house repeatedly, nodding with the intensity of a general planning a siege. I realized, in that moment, that this wasn't going to be a small annoyance. Karen was building a war campaign in her mind, and we were the uninvited targets. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, and muttered to my spouse, I think this just became personal. And in a way, it already had. We were no longer just new residents trying to settle in. We were the family who dared to refuse Karen's HOA demands, the family who, apparently, needed to be reminded of the consequences. And somehow, I had a feeling that the first confrontation was only the beginning. Little did we know, Karen had already started planning her next move, a move that would escalate far beyond letters and lectures, eventually bringing the police to our doorstep. But for now, all we could do was brace ourselves and try to enjoy our new home, while the shadow of Karen's clipboard loomed ever larger over the lawn. It started like any other quiet Saturday morning. I had just brewed my first cup of coffee and was enjoying the smell of bacon wafting through the kitchen when my spouse's voice cut through the calm. Do we have company?" I looked out the window and froze. Flashing blue and red lights were bouncing across our driveway. My heart sank. This was not the welcome committee we had been expecting. Within seconds, 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car, walking toward our front door. My stomach flipped. I opened the door slowly, trying to look calm, but the kids peeked nervously from behind my legs. "Good morning, officers," I said, forcing a smile. "Can I help you?" One of them scratched his head, glancing at a note in his hand. "We received a complaint regarding a possible violation of HOA rules," he said. That's when I noticed her. Karen, standing a few feet behind the officers, clipboard at the ready, a satisfied smile on her face like she had just summoned the cavalry to enforce her personal kingdom. I couldn't believe it. She actually called the police because we hadn't joined the HOA. I took a deep breath. "I see. Well, you should know that we're not legally required to join the HOA. We've consulted the rules, and everything on our property is perfectly within our rights." Karen stepped forward, waving her clipboard as if it were proof of her authority. "Officer, they are refusing to participate in community regulations. How can this neighborhood maintain harmony if they refuse to cooperate?" The officers exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we understand your concern, but HOA membership is generally voluntary unless it's part of your deed agreement. We can't enforce private agreements like this unless it's in the law." Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly masked it. "I just want what's best for everyone," she said, her voice pitched with the righteous certainty of a crusader. "They should understand that their actions affect the whole community." I tried not to laugh. "We do understand. That's why we're following all the rules that legally apply to us. Everything else is optional." One of the officers jotted down some notes and nodded at me. "As long as you're in compliance with local laws and your property agreements, there's nothing here we can act on. You're free to continue living your life." Karen's face flushed with irritation, but she waved dismissively. "You'll see. This won't be the end. Neighborhood harmony must be preserved." The officers gave me polite smiles and walked back to their car. The flashing lights disappeared, leaving the quiet neighborhood more tense than ever. Karen stood there for a moment, muttering something under her breath about people who refuse to obey rules, before storming back to her house like a general retreating from battle. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. My spouse gave me a look that said, "Well, that just escalated quickly." We spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off the tension. The kids were worried, asking if Karen was going to call the police every day now. I couldn't lie to them, it was hard to know what she was capable of. And the neighborhood, I could feel their eyes on us. Some were sympathetic, nodding as we passed, while others looked at us warily, no doubt wondering if we were going to be the troublemakers who brought chaos to their peaceful streets. By noon, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just a quirky neighbor anymore. She was a force of nature, the kind that turns tiny disagreements into full-blown spectacles. Her obsession with control had crossed a line, and I had a feeling she wouldn't stop until she'd done everything in her power to make our lives miserable. That night, as I sat on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker across the quiet lawns, I realized we were in for a long, exhausting battle. Karen had already escalated beyond letters and polite visits. She had called in the authorities, and while nothing legally happened that day, the message was clear. She would use any tool at her disposal to enforce her will. And that was when it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with a stubborn neighbor. I was dealing with someone who viewed herself as the self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood, someone who had no sense of boundaries and no idea how ridiculous she looked to everyone else. And that, I decided, would be both her strength and her downfall. Little did I know, this police visit was only the beginning. The drama was just getting started, and the next move would involve not just neighbors and letters, but legal advice, growing tension, and Karen's increasingly desperate antics. After the police visit, life in the neighborhood changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Suddenly, every walk to the mailbox felt like a covert mission, and every neighbor we passed seemed to have an opinion about us, mostly because of Karen. It was as if she had set herself up as the unofficial spokesperson for the entire street, and anyone who dared defy her imaginary rules was instantly labeled a threat to the community's peace. The first hint of real trouble came when our neighbor across the street, a sweet elderly couple we'd thought were friendly, hesitated when I waved at them. They whispered something to each other and gave me a cautious nod. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that Karen's influence was spreading faster than I could have imagined. She didn't just enforce rules, she enforced judgment, and soon, everyone in the neighborhood seemed to be watching us through her lens. Then came the mandatory HOA tea parties. I still can't decide whether to laugh or cry thinking about them. Karen, dressed in her pastel blazer like some suburban queen, would knock on doors and invite, or rather, insist that every homeowner attend. The purpose? To discuss community standards and ensure harmony, she said. But in reality, it was a spectacle designed to intimidate anyone who might think of stepping out of line. We attended the first one out of curiosity, if nothing else. Karen stood at the center of her living room, clipboard in hand, and lectured like a general addressing her troops. She criticized lawn angles, mailbox colors, and even the wrong shade of welcome mats. Neighbors nodded nervously, clearly afraid of crossing her. When it was our turn to speak, I tried to be polite and brief. "We're happy to follow local laws and community guidelines where applicable," I said, hopping to signal compliance without surrendering to her control. Karen's eyes narrowed and I felt a shiver. "That's not quite enough," she said, tapping her clipboard. She glanced around the room and I could see her mentally filing away notes on every household. Harmony requires participation, real participation, not just following the law. I wanted to laugh in her face, but I held it in. Some neighbors were already snickering behind her back, but they were too afraid to speak up. Karen's influence had everyone walking on eggshells, and it was exhausting. At home, we started noticing the more subtle effects of her reign. A package delivered to our porch was photographed by someone and sent to her. A small garden decoration was commented on by a neighbor with a nervous glance, as if they were reporting to HQ. Every little thing we did became fodder for speculation. The kids, of course, were thrilled. They called Karen, the clipboard lady, and joked about setting up a spy camera to see what ridiculous rule she would try to enforce next. At first, it was funny, but then it started to wear on me. We moved into this neighborhood to live peacefully, and now it felt like we were trapped in a constant game of don't offend Karen. Despite the chaos, I began to notice a pattern. Karen's obsession with control seemed to be growing almost daily. She would patrol the streets, sometimes alone, sometimes with neighbors she had apparently recruited as her loyal deputies. Every time we left the house, I felt eyes on us, measuring our compliance. And yet, amid the tension, a small sense of satisfaction started to creep in. Karen's obsession was making her overextend herself. Every visit, every lecture, every mandatory meeting was a glimpse into her own insecurity. I realized that the more she tried to control us, the more obvious it became to others that her authority was self-imposed, not real. Still, we couldn't relax. The neighborhood had split into factions, and gossip ran like wildfire. Some whispered support for Karen, while others quietly admired our courage in refusing to bow to her rules. Every glance, every passing wave, every murmured conversation reminded us that this was far from over. Karen had escalated, and the stage was set for even more dramatic encounters. By the end of the week, I made a silent promise to myself. We wouldn't let Karen intimidate us, but we would also play the long game. She might have influence over the neighborhood, but she couldn't touch the law or our patience. Little did we know, the next escalation was already brewing. Letters, meetings, and lectures were only the beginning. Karen's determination to enforce her rules was about to collide with our determination to live freely, and that collision would soon involve legal advice, fines, and the kind of chaos that only someone obsessed with control could create. By the time Monday rolled around, I realized we couldn't handle Karen on our own anymore. Her obsession with control had escalated from letters to police visits to public lectures disguised as community meetings. Every mailbox drop, every whisper on the street reminded us that Karen was building a dossier on our family. It wasn't just irritating, it was stressful, borderline absurd, and frankly, exhausting. So we did what any reasonable people would do. We called a lawyer. I'll admit, walking into the office felt almost comical. Here I was, explaining that our neighbor was running around like a self-appointed sheriff, armed with a clipboard, and trying to enforce rules that weren't even legally binding. My lawyer listened patiently, nodding at first, then smiling in that way professionals do when they think, "Oh, this is going to be interesting." "You're in your rights," she said finally, tapping her pen on the desk. "As long as you comply with city ordinances and your property deed, there's nothing Karen can legally make you do. HOA membership is generally voluntary unless it's in your contract. Document everything, letters, emails, visits. Keep a record of her interactions. That will protect you if she escalates further." That's when I realized our next step wasn't just patience, it was strategy. Karen was already escalating, and if we didn't respond carefully, her obsession could create real headaches. So we started documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every lecture, every absurd warning about towel colors or mailbox angles went into a folder labeled, humorously enough, Karen's Chronicles. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior started to become almost cartoonish. She would patrol the street like a general inspecting her troops, muttering about violations we didn't even know existed. One afternoon, she marched up to our house and loudly informed the mail carrier that our mailbox was not properly aligned with the community's aesthetic vision. I swear, even the mailman looked like he wanted to disappear into a cloud of shame and confusion. Neighbors whispered about her increasingly erratic behavior. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others tiptoed past our yard, as if stepping on the wrong patch of grass would earn them a spot on Karen's list. And Karen seemed oblivious to the fact that she was slowly turning herself into a spectacle. Her obsession with enforcement, which she thought made her powerful, was only making her look more extreme. We tried to remain calm, but it wasn't easy. Every encounter with Karen carried a tension that could snap at any moment. One evening, as I was watering the garden, she appeared in her usual pastel blazer, clipboard in hand, peering over the fence like a hawk. "Your rose bushes are slightly asymmetrical," she said, squinting. "It could affect the neighborhood's harmony." I forced a smile and replied, "Noted, we'll adjust them for maximum harmony." I couldn't help but think she probably believed she was on a mission from the universe itself. Even as Karen became more obsessive, the documentation gave me a strange sense of control. Every letter and visit we recorded became proof of her overreach. Every threat and warning, no matter how ridiculous, was evidence of her fixation on control rather than actual authority. I started to realize that while Karen might think she was winning, she was actually digging a deeper hole for herself, one we just had to watch carefully. The tension was relentless. The kids were starting to joke about Karen patrols, drawing imaginary maps of her routes. I found myself laughing at their antics, grateful for the tiny moments of levity amidst the chaos. Humor became our secret weapon against her intensity. But beneath the laughter, I knew the situation was escalating toward something bigger. Karen's obsession wasn't just annoying, it was unsustainable. It was only a matter of time before her own overreach would come back to haunt her, and when that happened, we would be ready. Little did we know, the stage was already being set for her undoing. The next part of the story would involve signs of her own mismanagement, financial and otherwise, and the dramatic moment when Karen's obsession collided with consequences far beyond our control. The tension was building, and the audience, I realized, would be watching every absurd, suspenseful step. By now, Karen's obsession with control had become a full-time spectacle. She patrolled the neighborhood like a general inspecting her troops, clipboard in hand, muttering about every tiny deviation from her imagined rules. But the more extreme she became, the more we started noticing cracks in her armor. It began subtly. A neighbor mentioned seeing her frantically counting coins on her kitchen table while lecturing someone about proper mailbox alignment. Another whispered that she had been spotted hurrying into the bank multiple times, muttering about overdue notices. At first, we thought it was just gossip, but when you live across the street from someone like Karen, you learn to read the signs. Something was off. One morning, I saw her storming out of her house with her clipboard and a stack of papers. She slammed the door behind her, muttering furiously. A piece of paper slipped from her hands and fluttered onto her lawn. I couldn't resist picking it up out of curiosity. My spouse groaned, "Don't look, it's probably just more rules about towel colors." But I did look, and there it was, a notice from the IRS peeking out of the pile. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't believe it, but the handwriting on the notice was unmistakable: unpaid taxes, penalties, and a series of escalating fines. It was almost poetic. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of every imagined neighborhood slight, was secretly drowning in her own financial chaos. Over the next few days, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She would storm down the street in the middle of the afternoon, shouting at invisible offenders while simultaneously checking her bank app on her phone. We noticed her muttering about deadlines, receipts, and community harmony in the same breath, a jumbled mantra of stress and control. The humor of the situation wasn't lost on my family. The kids started joking about creating a reality TV show called Karen vs. the IRS, complete with dramatic theme music and imaginary commercial breaks. I laughed along with them, but underneath the jokes, I felt a sense of relief. The woman who had been terrorizing our family and the neighborhood for weeks was finally showing signs of weakness. We continued documenting everything, of course. Karen's frantic visits, her angry mutterings, the bizarre letters, everything went into our growing folder of Karen's Chronicles. It was strangely satisfying to watch someone so obsessed with order unravel because of her own mistakes. Still, the suspense lingered. Karen's obsession hadn't disappeared, it had just shifted. Instead of focusing solely on us, she seemed to be spiraling into her own private chaos. Every knock at the door, every whispered conversation in the neighborhood, every misplaced lawn ornament seemed to push her further toward a breaking point. One afternoon, as I trimmed the hedges, I noticed her peering over her fence, squinting at our property with an intensity that suggested she was preparing a full report. But this time, her expression was different. There was frustration, exhaustion, even panic behind her eyes. The power she thought she wielded seemed to be slipping through her fingers. It was a strange mix of suspense and humor. On one hand, I was relieved that Karen's control over the neighborhood was faltering. On the other, I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of the situation. A woman obsessed with enforcing imaginary rules being undone by real-life obligations she had ignored. And yet, I knew the drama wasn't over. Karen's obsession hadn't disappeared, it had simply taken a new form, one that was entirely outside our control. The tension in the neighborhood was still palpable. Every neighbor we passed looked a little nervous, a little excited, as if waiting for the next scene in a suspenseful drama to unfold. By the end of the week, I realized that the universe was about to deliver poetic justice. Karen's obsession had set the stage for a dramatic confrontation with consequences far beyond our yard lines and mailbox alignments. The next chapter wouldn't be about letters or lectures or even police visits. It would be about someone finally holding Karen accountable in a way she couldn't micromanage. Little did she know, her obsession had not only drawn attention to her mismanagement, but had also set her up for a spectacular fall. And from our porch, we could only watch, popcorn in hand, as the suspense built toward the moment that would change everything in our little neighborhood. It started like any ordinary morning. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, enjoying the quiet hum of suburban life, when I noticed something unusual across the street. Karen's house was a flurry of activity. Papers flew out of her hands, her pastel blazer was slightly wrinkled, and for the first time her hair looked less than perfect. Something was happening, and it didn't involve us. Moments later, I saw them. black SUVs, official-looking cars, and a few agents in crisp suits walking toward her door with serious expressions. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the IRS had finally arrived. Karen, of course, did not react calmly. She opened her door and practically screamed at the agents, waving her hands like a conductor trying to control an orchestra that refused to follow her tempo. "This is an outrage. You can't just barge in like this. I'm the neighborhood. I enforce rules." One of the agents raised a calm hand and said something that sounded like, "Ma'am, please step aside." But Karen ignored him completely. She was flailing, gesturing to imaginary violators in the neighborhood, ranting about how the universe had conspired against her because of our mailbox. Her lawn, community harmony. I couldn't tell, but she was furious, and the entire street was starring. I peeked through our blinds, trying not to laugh too loudly. It was surreal. The woman who had spent weeks micromanaging every lawn, every mailbox, every detail of everyone else's lives was completely powerless now. She was trying to control agents with badges, and the universe was laughing at her. The agents calmly went about their business, walking into her house with clips of paperwork and calculators, while Karen continued her tirade. "This isn't fair. You don't understand the neighborhood. You don't understand me," she shouted, throwing her clipboard to the ground. Across the street, neighbors peeked out of their windows, whispering excitedly. Some were trying not to laugh, others were cheering quietly. Karen had long been the self-appointed sheriff of the cul-de-sac, and now, for the first time, she was the one under scrutiny. The irony was almost unbearable. I watched as she stomped from room to room, still trying to assert authority over the agents while frantically rifling through piles of papers. I imagined her muttering to herself about fines, letters, and community rules, all of which were completely meaningless in the face of actual law enforcement. It was almost poetic. The suspense was unbearable. Every neighbor seemed to lean a little closer to their windows, waiting to see how this would end. And then, slowly, the shouting started to die down. Karen's face turned from fiery red to a muted pink, and eventually to a pale shade of resignation. The agents were leaving, clipboards full, papers in hand, and Karen was left standing in the doorway, breathing heavily, looking like a storm had passed over her. I stepped onto our porch, trying to catch my breath. The kids ran out of the house, eyes wide, asking if Karen was finally going to be quiet now. I smiled, shaking my head. "I think she just got a lesson in humility," I said. For the first time since we moved in, the tension in the neighborhood shifted. Karen, who had once ruled every conversation, every meeting, every glance with her clipboard and her obsessive rules, now seemed smaller, vulnerable, human even. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of relief, knowing that her obsession had led her into chaos that she couldn't control. Yet even in her defeat, Karen tried to hold on to whatever dignity she could. I saw her muttering something about neighborhood harmony as she closed her door, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. The clipboard, once a symbol of fear, now lay discarded on the floor, an emblem of her unraveling. From my porch, I watched the agents drive away, leaving a quiet street behind. The neighbors whispered among themselves, exchanging glances and half-smiles. Karen had been undone not by us, not by the police, not by laws she tried to manipulate, but by something she couldn't control, her own obsession and mismanagement. I poured myself another cup of coffee and leaned back, savoring the absurdity and the satisfaction. There was still drama in the neighborhood, but for the first time, it felt like the balance had shifted. Karen's reign of micromanagement had taken a serious hit, and life, finally, could return to some semblance of peace. And yet, as I watched the dust settle, I couldn't help but smile. The story wasn't just about victory, it was about patience, persistence, and knowing when to stand your ground. Karen had taught me, in the most dramatic way possible, that obsession and control rarely end well. Sometimes, the universe has a funny way of restoring order all on its own. After the chaos of the IRS visit, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. Karen's firebrand reign, the endless lectures, the patrols with her clipboard, the whispered warnings to neighbors, all of it seemed to lose its power overnight. She was still there, of course, scurrying around her yard like a woman trying to reclaim control, but there was a new tension in the air. For the first time, she looked unsure, vulnerable, human. I stepped onto the porch that morning with a sense of relief I hadn't felt since moving in. The kids ran to the street to play, shouting and laughing without fear of scrutiny. My spouse smiled and shook their head. "I can't believe it's finally quiet," they said. It was a delicate quiet, though, the kind that comes after a storm. The neighborhood had seen Karen at her most obsessive, and now it was watching as she recovered from the blow. But for us, life had begun to return to normal. Our mailbox stayed put, our lawn grew at its own pace, and most importantly, we could live without the constant shadow of judgment hanging over every little thing we did. Even Karen's mandatory meetings had dwindled. The tea parties she once insisted upon, clipboard in hand, were now fewer and far between. Neighbors whispered that she had become more preoccupied with personal matters, and perhaps rightly so, given the IRS visit. The once dreaded name on the street had lost its intimidation factor. Still, life in the neighborhood had changed in subtle ways. There were new boundaries, quiet ones that everyone respected. People were still polite, still smiled and waved, but no one was quite as fearful of a clipboard-wielding enforcer. The sense of community had shifted, not because Karen had vanished entirely, but because we, as residents, realized that standing your ground mattered. That civility didn't have to come at the cost of autonomy. I laughed quietly to myself one evening, thinking about how absurd the entire saga had been. The woman who had demanded obedience over trivial details, who had lectured the neighborhood about towel colors and mailbox alignments, had been undone by her own obsession. Her meticulous rules, her threats, her self-appointed authority, it had all collapsed spectacularly under the weight of reality. And yet, there was a strange lesson in it all. Karen's story wasn't just about a neighbor gone rogue. It was about human nature, about control, and about the limits of obsession. Sometimes, people become so consumed with enforcing rules that they forget to enforce them on themselves. The universe, it seems, has its own way of balancing things out. We continued documenting, of course, more for memory than necessity now. The Karen Chronicles folder had grown fat with letters, emails, pictures, and notes. It was almost like a scrapbook of absurdity, a reminder of what we endured, and more importantly, what we overcame. Life began to feel normal. The kids rode their bikes in the street without worry. We had backyard barbecues without feeling scrutinized. And when we passed Karen on the sidewalk, there was a polite nod, but no scolding, no lecture, no clipboard looming ominously over us. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I realized, as I watched the sun set over our yard, that this story wasn't just about defeating a controlling neighbor. It was about patience, strategy, and humor. About standing firm, documenting your rights, and knowing that sometimes, you don't have to fight every battle. The universe has a way of delivering justice in ways you can't anticipate. And as for Karen, she eventually retreated into her own world of obsession, papers, and unpaid fines. The neighborhood moved on, and the sense of peace we had once dreamed about finally arrived. But we never forgot the lessons she unintentionally taught us. I took a final sip of my coffee that evening and smiled. The chaos, the absurdity, the stress, it had all been worth it. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly at home. And as I looked around at the quiet, sunlit streets and the kids laughing in the yard, I realized something important. Peace isn't just about avoiding conflict. Sometimes, it's about standing your ground and watching the storm pass, while keeping a sense of humor intact. The HOA war had ended. Harmony at last was ours, and we had a story that no one, neighbor or friend would ever forget. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.